The crackling of the fire was deafening, a roar that seemed to come from the very heart of the building. The smell of smoke was thick and suffocating, burning the inside of his nostrils and coating his throat with an acrid sting. Firefighter James Harris moved with practiced urgency, each step calculated, each breath steady, despite the heat that seemed to grow stronger by the second. His team had been on this call for nearly 20 minutes, and yet, it felt like the fire was only getting worse. The building, a two-story duplex tucked in the middle of a quiet suburban street, had already been engulfed in flames when they arrived. James had seen his share of fires, from kitchen mishaps to full-blown infernos, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just the size of the fire or the way the structure was beginning to collapse. It was the knowledge that someone was still inside, someone who couldn't get out on their own. "Where's the elderly woman?" he barked to his team as they set up their hoses outside, trying to douse the flames as best they could. "She's upstairs near the back bedroom," shouted another firefighter, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "She's trapped in there." James' heart raced. He had been a firefighter for almost 10 years, but every rescue still carried with it a gut-wrenching weight. Every time they pulled someone from the wreckage, every time they saved a life, it felt like they were defying the odds. But it also reminded him how fragile life could be. How quickly things could go from normal to chaos. Without hesitation, James grabbed his axe, secured his air tank, and made a beeline for the front door. His boots thudded against the floor as he pushed through the smoke and heat, navigating the now dark interior of the house. He could barely see a few feet ahead of him, the smoke thick and dense, but his training kicked in. He knew where the rooms were. He'd studied the layout of the house before. Upstairs, the fire was even worse. The flames were licking at the walls, and the floorboards were beginning to creak under the strain of the fire's heat. As James reached the door to the back bedroom, he could hear the faintest sound, soft cries, someone in pain. "Ma'am," he shouted, banging on the door with his fist. "I'm here to help you. Stay calm." There was no answer at first, but then he heard it again, a muffled voice calling for help. He wasted no time. He swung the door open, the heat from the flames nearly knocking him back, but he forced himself forward. There, curled up in the corner, was the woman, thin, frail, and shaking. Her clothes were singed and her face was smudged with soot, but she was alive. "Grab my arm," James shouted, his voice cutting through the smoke. He reached out to her, pulling her to her feet as best he could. She winced in pain but managed to clutch his arm, her frail body trembling with fear. "We have to go now," he urged, pulling her toward the door. But as they stepped forward, the floor beneath them buckled, the heat increasing to unbearable levels. James gritted his teeth, the sound of cracking wood and shifting beams deafening in his ears. He could feel the weight of the woman's body against him, could sense her exhaustion, her helplessness. But they had to move quickly. He couldn't afford to lose time. With one final push, he got them both to the stairs. He could hear the faint crackling of the flames below, but there was no turning back. They had to get out. The next few moments were a blur. He carried her down the stairs, avoiding the collapsing debris, as the air around them seemed to grow hotter. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but the woman was lighter than he expected. It was as though her body was limp with exhaustion, and he realized for a moment that he was doing more than just saving her from a fire. He was saving her from death itself. They made it outside finally. James dropped to his knees, exhausted but relieved, as the woman was taken from his arms by the paramedics. He could barely catch his breath, his lungs burning from the smoke, but he didn't care. He had done what he came for. The fire still raged behind them, the house engulfed in flames as the fire trucks continued to battle the inferno, but James didn't look back. His focus was on the woman, now receiving treatment from the paramedics. Her chest was rising and falling with shallow breaths, but she was alive. She was going to be okay. As they took her away on a stretcher, James stood up, wiping the sweat and soot from his brow. He could feel the weight of the rescue pressing down on him, but also the rush of success. This was what he had trained for, what he had dedicated his life to. Saving lives. And for today it had been enough. He turned to walk back to the fire trucks, ready to assist with the next steps of putting out the fire, but as he did, he heard a voice behind him. "Hey you," a man shouted, running toward him. "You're the one who saved my mom." James turned around, startled. The man approaching him was well-dressed, his face flushed with relief and gratitude. "I'm what?" James stuttered, unsure of what the man was talking about. "My mom, she's the one you just pulled out of that fire." The man's voice cracked slightly with emotion. "You saved her life. I'm Jack Hamilton, her son. And I need to thank you." James blinked, still trying to process. He had rescued someone, he didn't even know their name. He had done what he was trained to do. But now this man was standing before him, clearly overwhelmed with gratitude. And as he looked at Jack Hamilton, James noticed the expensive suit, the polished shoes, and the wealth in his demeanor. This man wasn't just anyone. He was someone who had money, someone who could probably do a lot to show appreciation. I was just doing my job, James muttered, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. No, Jack insisted. You don't understand. My mom, she's been everything to me. She's the reason I've made something of myself. She's always been there. And now you saved her. Jack pulled out a card from his wallet and handed it to James. Call me, he said, his voice calm but still emotional. I want to make sure you're taken care of. I owe you more than words can say. James took the card, still in a daze. I don't need anything, he started to say, but Jack raised his hand. No, you don't understand. You saved my mom. That's worth everything. I want to make sure you're set up for life. You've earned it. James felt a lump in his throat, and for the first time that day he found himself speechless. He had always worked hard, always put everything into his job. But to be offered something in return? Something far beyond what he had ever imagined? Before he could respond, Jack turned to leave, saying only, "We'll talk soon." James watched as Jack disappeared into the crowd of emergency responders and bystanders, his thoughts swirling. The sound of the fire trucks, the whirling sirens, the flashing lights, all of it felt distant now. For the first time in a long time, James wondered if this rescue, this simple act of heroism, might be the turning point he had been waiting for. He turned back to watch the firefighters continue their work, the fire still raging in the distance. He had saved a life today. But now he realized that act might have saved his own future in ways he hadn't anticipated. The following day, as the sun rose over the smoldering remains of the duplex, James Harris stood on the steps of the firehouse, his uniform still dirty from the previous night's ordeal. His body ached from the constant exertion, and his muscles felt heavy from the smoke inhalation, but the adrenaline that had driven him through the fire was still wearing off. Now all he could think about was the elderly woman he had pulled from the blaze, Mrs. Hamilton. He had learned her name was, her fragile body limp in his arms, the warmth of her hands slowly growing colder as he rushed her to safety. He hadn't expected to be thinking about her so much. After all, he'd rescued people countless times before. But there was something different about her. Something that lingered in his mind. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her eyes, or the way she had clung to him as he carried her, not just in fear but in desperate gratitude. She hadn't said much, but the way she had looked at him as if she were trusting him with her very life had affected him deeply. His shift had ended hours ago, and he had already received a few calls from colleagues checking in on him, making sure he was all right. It was part of the brotherhood of the firehouse, everyone looking out for each other. But James had been quiet, his mind still preoccupied. He needed to focus on the present, to shake off the lingering images of the fire and the woman's pale face, but it was easier said than done. As he stood on the steps of the firehouse, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its tires crunching against the gravel. The car was out of place, far too fancy for this part of town, and for a moment James thought it was just another person passing by. But as the car came to a stop, the door opened, and a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out. The man's dark hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes were hidden behind a pair of aviator sunglasses, but there was something unmistakable about his demeanor. He carried himself like someone used to getting what he wanted. James narrowed his eyes as the man made his way across the parking lot toward him. He didn't recognize the man, but there was a certainty in his step that made James uneasy. The last thing he needed was some rich guy trying to buy him off or make him feel indebted for doing his job. "Are you James Harris?" the man asked, his voice calm but authoritative. James nodded, unsure of where this was headed. "Yeah, that's me. Can I help you with something?" The man took off his sunglasses, revealing a pair of piercing blue eyes that seemed to measure him up and down. "My name's Jack Hamilton. I'm Mrs. Hamilton's son." The name caught James off guard. "Wait, you mean, the woman I pulled out of the fire last night?" Jack nodded, a tight smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, that's her. I wanted to thank you personally for saving her life." James shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "I was just doing my job, Mr. Hamilton. I'm glad I could help, but—" No, Jack interrupted, his voice firm now. "You don't understand. My mother is everything to me. She's been through so much and I know how fragile she is. I'm not here just to thank you. I want to offer something in return." James raised an eyebrow, instantly wary. The offer of a reward always made him uncomfortable. He wasn't in this line of work for the recognition or the money. He had chosen this job because it mattered to him, because he wanted to make a difference. But now, standing in front of this well-dressed man who seemed to have an abundance of resources, James felt a sense of unease. "I really didn't do it for anything in return," James said, trying to deflect. "I'm just happy she's going to be okay." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he hadn't expected James to brush him off. "I understand that. But you don't know the full extent of what this means to me. My mother, she's not just a regular person. She's worked hard her entire life, built everything she has with her own hands. And now, she's the reason I have what I do. I owe her everything." James nodded, still uncertain of where this conversation was going. He had heard the stories of wealthy families who had everything handed to them on a silver platter. But this man Jack was different. There was sincerity in his voice, a rawness that James couldn't ignore. "I get that you're grateful, but I really don't need anything," James said. "I'm just doing my job. That's all." Jack stood there for a moment, his gaze steady. "It's not about what you need. It's about what you deserve. You risked your life to save my mother. And I'm offering you something in return, a gesture of gratitude if you will. I have connections. I can make sure you never want for anything again." James was silent for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. He had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to earn his way through hard work. The idea of someone, especially someone as wealthy as Jack, offering him a handout no matter how well-intentioned, didn't sit right with him. It felt wrong. He wasn't a charity case. He didn't need anyone to feel sorry for him. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hamilton," James said, taking a deep breath. "But I'm not looking for a handout. I don't need anyone to do anything for me. I'm happy with my life and I'm grateful for the chance to do what I do. That's all I need." Jack studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his response. There was an odd look in his eyes, something like surprise mixed with admiration. Finally he exhaled slowly, nodding. "I understand," he said. "But just know, if you ever change your mind, the offer still stands. You saved my mother's life. I won't forget that." With that, Jack turned and walked back toward his car, his footsteps steady and sure. James stood there for a long moment, watching him go. The weight of the conversation lingered in the air like smoke, but James didn't feel the sense of obligation or gratitude that Jack had hoped for. Instead, he felt a sense of relief. He had done the right thing. He had saved a life, and that was more than enough for him. As Jack's car disappeared down the street, James turned back toward the firehouse, his mind still racing with the conversation. He didn't know what to make of it or what would happen next. But one thing was clear: he hadn't done what he did for money or recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. And that, to him, was worth more than any offer of reward. The days following the rescue felt like they were caught in a haze of routine for James. The fire had been a violent one, a dangerous and frantic battle that had pushed his limits in ways that he had grown accustomed to over the years. But every fire, no matter how many you had fought, left an imprint. And this one, this rescue, was different. The image of Mrs. Hamilton's frail body in his arms, the grateful look on her face as he dragged her out of the smoke and flames, stuck with him. It wasn't just that she had been vulnerable or helpless. It was the weight of the moment, the knowledge that her life had hung in the balance. For a brief, fleeting moment, she had trusted him to be her lifeline, and that trust had anchored something deep within him. He couldn't forget the sound of her voice, weak and trembling, whispering a breathless "thank you" before she passed out from the smoke. James had been through enough fires in his career to know that sometimes just doing the job wasn't enough. The fires were fleeting, but the people, those faces you saved or couldn't save, stayed with you long after the last ember had burned out. And this time it was different. He wasn't sure why, but Mrs. Hamilton's rescue had etched itself into his heart in a way that none of the others had. As the hours bled into days, James threw himself back into his work. He didn't have the luxury of time to reflect. There were always more calls, more emergencies, and lives to be saved. But that Thursday, as he sat in the break room of the firehouse, nursing a cold cup of coffee, his phone buzzed, interrupting the quiet. It was a number he didn't recognize, and he hesitated before picking it up, expecting it to be another wrong number or a routine call. But when he answered, the voice on the other end immediately caught his attention. "James Harris?" the voice asked, smooth and composed. "Yeah, this is him," James replied, unsure where the conversation was going. "This is Jack Hamilton," the voice continued. "I'm Mrs. Hamilton's son. I wanted to reach out to you." James's stomach dropped at the mention of Mrs. Hamilton's name. He had never expected to hear from her family, certainly not so soon. The fire had been 2 days ago, and the chaos of it all still lingered in the back of his mind. He hadn't given much thought to the aftermath. He had simply done what he was trained to do, what he felt in his gut needed to be done. But now, this voice on the other end of the line was telling him that the woman he had saved had a family, and that they were looking for him. "Mr. Hamilton," James said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I'm glad to hear your mom's doing okay. But honestly, there's no need for me to." "I'm not calling to just thank you," Jack interrupted, his voice firm, but there was something behind it that James couldn't quite place. "I wanted to talk to you about something. I want to meet with you in person. I think we need to discuss how I can show my gratitude for what you did." James frowned. Gratitude? He had saved Mrs. Hamilton because it was his job, because that's what he was trained to do. But the idea that a gesture of kindness would lead to a meeting with someone who had the resources to change his life was starting to feel uncomfortable. He wasn't sure what Jack Hamilton wanted, but he didn't like the idea of being in debt to someone. "I really don't need anything," James replied, a hint of resistance creeping into his voice. "I was just doing my job, Mr. Hamilton. I'm glad your mom's safe, and that's all that matters to me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, James thought maybe the conversation was over. But then Jack spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. "I understand your hesitation," Jack said, his voice gentler now. "But listen, James, I've seen what people like you do. You save lives. You put everything on the line every single day. And my mother, she's more than just a regular person. She's been through a lot, and I know what it's like to lose someone you care about. I know what it's like to feel helpless. I just want to make sure you know that I appreciate you more than words can express." James felt a lump form in his throat as Jack's words registered. He wasn't used to hearing such sincerity, especially from someone like Jack. Someone who had the means to change things with a single phone call, someone whose life seemed so different from his own. "You don't have to do anything, really," James said, his voice softer now, though the unease was still there. "I didn't save her for a reward, Mr. Hamilton. I did it because that's my job." Jack let out a soft chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. "I know. But what I'm offering isn't just a reward, it's a way for me to show you that I recognize what you did. And I want to make sure you're taken care of. No strings attached." James swallowed, the knot in his stomach tightening. What was he supposed to say to that? He couldn't simply ignore Jack's offer. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about doing it for recognition. But there was something about Jack's tone, something in the way he spoke that made James feel like he was being offered more than just money. He was being offered an opportunity, something that could change his life in ways he couldn't even fathom. But still, James hesitated. He wasn't the kind of guy who took charity or handouts. He worked hard for everything he had. But then, as he thought about the circumstances, the long hours, the dangers, the sacrifice, it started to make sense in a strange way. Maybe it wasn't about the money. Maybe it was about being recognized for the life he was trying to build, for the good he was trying to do in a world that sometimes made it hard to find the rewards for it. "I'm not sure what you have in mind," James said slowly. "But if you're serious about this, I'm open to talking." "When and where?" Jack's voice brightened. "I'll have my assistant arrange everything. How about tomorrow afternoon? I'll send you the details. I look forward to meeting you in person." James hung up the phone, feeling conflicted. He hadn't expected any of this, hadn't expected the recognition or the opportunity that seemed to be coming his way. But now, with the promise of a meeting with Jack Hamilton, the son of the woman he had saved, it felt like everything was about to change. He had always done his job with pride, with honor. But now he couldn't help but wonder, what would this meeting mean for him? As he sat there, the weight of the upcoming conversation pressing on him, one thing was clear: his life and his future might never be the same again. The next day, James couldn't shake the feeling that his life had somehow shifted in a way he wasn't quite prepared for. The fire had been just another part of his job, at least that's what he had told himself. But now, with Jack Hamilton's offer on the table, James was left questioning everything. He wasn't one to seek attention or praise, but the idea that he could be offered something more, something beyond the life he had always known, made him uneasy. He had always worked hard, believed in the value of hard work, and expected little in return. So why did this offer feel so overwhelming? The following afternoon, James found himself in a small, upscale cafe, waiting for Jack Hamilton to arrive. He had dressed in his usual firefighter uniform, feeling slightly out of place in such a polished, pristine environment. He wasn't used to the finer things in life. His world had always been about practical things. His boots, his helmet, his uniform. The world Jack Hamilton occupied felt miles apart from his own, a world of wealth and privilege that James couldn't quite relate to. But here he was, sitting at a table, waiting for a man whose wealth and influence could open doors he never even knew existed. As he waited, James thought about Mrs. Hamilton again. The frail, vulnerable woman he had rescued, the one who had been trapped in that inferno. He could still hear her voice in his mind, soft and grateful, thanking him even as she faded into unconsciousness. He had saved her life, and for that he was grateful. He wasn't used to people like Jack Hamilton being involved in his world, but here they were, two people whose lives were now connected by one simple, heroic act. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the door to the cafe opened, and in walked Jack, wearing a tailored suit and a confident smile. He scanned the room briefly before spotting James, and with a nod, he made his way over to the table. "James?" Jack said, extending a hand. "It's good to finally meet you in person." James shook his hand firmly, though he felt awkward and out of place. "Nice to meet you too, Mr. Hamilton." "Please call me Jack," he said with a reassuring smile as he took a seat across from James. "I know this is probably a little out of the ordinary for you, but I wanted to make sure we had a chance to talk." James nodded, still unsure of how to approach the situation. "I'm not sure what to say. I didn't expect any of this." "I understand," Jack said, his tone softer now, almost understanding. "You're not used to this kind of attention. But what you did for my mother, it was more than just a rescue. You gave her something that no amount of money could buy. You saved her life, and I'll never forget that." James felt a lump in his throat. The words were sincere, but they still made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not for something that felt so natural to him. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, because that was what he had been trained to do. Saving people's lives wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about making a difference, even in the smallest way. "I just did what I was trained to do," James replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just doing my job." Jack nodded, acknowledging his humility, but then he leaned in slightly, his expression more serious. "I know. But what you did for her, for me, is something I can't ignore. And that's why I'm here." James furrowed his brow, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" "James," Jack began, his tone shifting to something more direct. "I'm offering you something, an opportunity if you will. I know you work hard and I know you've been through a lot. But I want to offer you a way out of this constant struggle. A way to make sure you don't have to worry about your next paycheck. I've got resources, connections, things I can do for you that would change your life." James sat back in his chair, startled. The last thing he had expected was for Jack to offer him money or a job. He had worked for everything he had, and the idea of being given something without earning it felt wrong to him. He wasn't looking for charity. He didn't want a handout. "I didn't do it for anything in return," James said, his voice steady but filled with discomfort. "I saved your mom's life because it was the right thing to do. I'm not looking for a reward." Jack held up a hand, his expression sincere. "I get that, James. But this isn't a reward. It's an opportunity. I'm offering you the chance to take control of your future, to not have to worry about the financial burdens that come with this kind of work. You've saved my mother's life, and now I want to give you the chance to make sure you have everything you need." James sat in stunned silence. He wasn't sure what to think, wasn't sure if he should take this offer seriously. Was it really possible to just be handed an opportunity like this? What would it mean for his pride? His sense of independence? "I'm not asking for anything in return, James," Jack continued, noticing the uncertainty on James's face. "I just want to make sure that your hard work doesn't go unnoticed. You've done more than just your job, you've done something that matters. And I think you deserve more." James took a deep breath, trying to process the gravity of the situation. For the first time, he could see that his actions had had an impact beyond the firehouse, beyond the walls of his own life. He had made a difference for someone else. And now he was being offered a chance to change the course of his own life. But could he accept it? Could he take the help without feeling like he was losing a part of himself? "I don't know," James said quietly, his eyes meeting Jack's. "It feels wrong to take something I haven't earned." Jack leaned back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully. "I get it, James. It's not easy to accept help. But sometimes life doesn't give you all the answers. Sometimes you have to take the chance when it's offered. You've earned it even if you don't see it that way." James's mind raced. He wasn't sure what to do. The firefighter in him, who had dedicated his life to helping others, felt like he should refuse to remain humble and self-sufficient. But the human in him, who had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, to push forward every day despite the struggles, felt like this was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. He had always been the one to save others, but maybe, just maybe, it was time for someone to offer him a chance to save himself. "I'll think about it," James said, the words coming out slower than he intended. "I'll think about it." Jack smiled, a hint of relief in his eyes. "That's all I'm asking. No pressure, just an opportunity. But know that the door is open whenever you're ready." As they stood up to leave, Jack extended his hand once again, this time with a firm grip that seemed to carry both understanding and promise. James shook it, still uncertain, but something inside him, something deep down, told him that this meeting, this moment, would be one that changed everything. His life wasn't just defined by the fires he fought or the people he saved, it could be defined by the choices he made in moments like this. And for the first time in a long time, James felt like he had a choice. What he would do with that choice, however, was still unclear. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let fear make the decision for him.